In 1804, one man shook the entire African continent. He was not a king by birth. He was not a warrior by training. He was a scholar, a teacher, a man of prayer. But Uthman Dan Fodio would go on to build one of the largest empires in African history at that time, a caliphate that stretched over 200,000 square miles from what is now Burkina Faso in the west to the mountains of Cameroon in the east, an empire of 20 million souls. And then, in April of 1817, he was gone. The official story, he died peacefully, a long illness, quiet passing. His son Mohammed Bello took over, case closed. But there are people, entire communities, whose grandparents told a very different story. A story of poisoned arrows in the Benue Hills, a story of a great battle that has been scrubbed from official history, a story of a man who did not die in bed, but died because he dared to push too far. Today on Edu History TV, we go deep, we investigate, we put the official record against the oral tradition, and we let you decide what really happened to Uthman Dan Fodio. To understand how Dan Fodio died, we must first understand who he truly was, because most people only know half the story. On the 15th of December 1754, in the small village of Marata in the Hausa city state of Gobia, a boy was born into a scholarly Fulani family. His father, Mohammed Fodio, was an Islamic jurist. His mother, Hawa, was herself descended from a long line of teachers and scholars. His grandmother, Rukia, was a respected ascetic whose works were studied across the region. This boy, Uthman ibn Mohammed ibn Uthman, would one day be called Shehu, the Sheikh, the great reformer, but for now, he was just a student. By the age of 20, Dan Fodio had studied under some of the most brilliant Islamic minds of his era. He traveled to the great Saharan city of Agadez, in what is now Niger, to sit at the feet of Jibril ibn Yuma, one of the most radical Islamic thinkers of that century. It was Jibril who initiated Dan Fodio into the Qadiriyya Sufi Brotherhood. But even then, even as a student, Dan Fodio was not a man who simply accepted what he was told. He both respected and critiqued his teacher. He returned to Hausaland burning with a singular vision. The rulers of these kingdoms were mixing Islamic practice with paganism, taxing the poor into ruin, and living lives of corruption that made a mockery of the faith they claimed to uphold. And Dan Fodio began to preach. For years he traveled from village to village across Kebbi, Gobia and Zamfara, building a following known as the Jama. His words were electric. His reputation spread so far that even kings began to invite him to their courts. And then, those same kings began to fear him. Sarkin Gobia Nafata saw this scholar as a dangerous rival and began closing the net. He issued a royal proclamation forbidding anyone but Dan Fodio himself from preaching, banning conversion, and stripping his followers of the right to wear turbans and veils. The message was unmistakable. This was no longer just a religious debate. It was becoming a war. Then Nafata died, and his successor made everything worse. In 1802, Yunfa Nafata's son, and ironically a former student of Dan Fodio himself, took the throne of Gobia. When Nafata had restricted Dan Fodio, Yunfa moved to destroy him entirely. He exiled Dan Fodio to the village of Dijel, and when that was not enough, he began attacking and arresting members of Dan Fodio's community. Dan Fodio led hundreds of his followers out of Gobia into exile in the countryside. He was done with talking. And in 1804, when Yunfa's armies moved to finish the job, Dan Fodio raised his banner and declared jihad. What followed was one of the most remarkable military and religious revolutions in African history. Within 4 years, by 1808, Dan Fodio's forces had conquered Gobia, Kano, Katsina, Dora, and half a dozen other Hausa city-states. Yunfa himself was killed in the final battle at Al-Kalawa. Fulani emirs replaced Hausa kings across the entire north, and at the center of it all stood Uthman Dan Fodio, commander of the faithful, first caliph of the Sokoto Caliphate. His empire would grow to cover 200,000 square miles. By the time his son Mohammed Bello's rule ended in 1837, the Sokoto Caliphate had become the most populous empire in all of West Africa, with an estimated 20 million people. This was no minor figure. This was Africa's Napoleon, Africa's Thomas Cromwell, a man who reshaped the entire political and religious map of a continent. So when a man like this dies, the world wants to know how. By 1811, something remarkable happened, and historians often overlook its significance. Uthman Dan Fodio retired from battle. Now think about that. This was 1811. His armies were still fighting. They would not finish their campaigns until 1815. But Dan Fodio, the commander of the faithful, the Caliph, stepped back. He handed the daily administration of the empire to his son Mohammed Bello, who governed the eastern half from Sokoto, and to his brother Abdullahi Dan Fodio, who governed the western half from Gwandu. Why did he withdraw? Historians like Murray Last and Mervyn Hiskett, the author of The Sword of Truth, one of the definitive biographies of Dan Fodio, point to a deep disillusionment. The Jihad had succeeded militarily, but the very things Dan Fodio had fought against, corruption, oppression of the common people, a ruling class enriching itself while ordinary citizens suffered, all of it was beginning to return, this time within his own caliphate. Even in retirement, Dan Fodio could not stay silent. Every Thursday night, he held weekly meetings with those around him, and he criticized the new caliphate. He attacked the tendency of the new bureaucracy to become another oppressive ruling class. The same disease that had infected the Hausa kings was now infecting his own administrators. It was a profound sadness for a man who had sacrificed everything for a vision of justice. Between 1810 and 1815, he lived in the town of Safawa, a modest settlement near Sokoto. His son Bello built him a house. He lived simply. He gathered 300 students around him, and he wrote. Scholars count among his surviving works over 120 books, treatises, and poems, the vast majority of them written in these quiet years at Safawa. These were arguably the most productive intellectual years of his life. In 1815, he moved back to Sokoto, the city that bore his legacy. His son had built him a house in the western suburbs. He was 61 years old. He had lived an extraordinary life. And now, the man who once commanded armies was teaching students and writing books. 2 years later, April 20th, 1817, Uthman Dan Fodio was dead. So what does the official historical record tell us about how he died? According to every major academic source, the Encyclopedia Britannica, Black Past, Org, the University of Pennsylvania's African Studies Center, the EBSCO Academic Database, the Library of Congress, the answer is the same. Uthman Dan Fodio died after a long illness in Sokoto at the age of 62 on April the 20th, 1817. One comparative academic study published in a Nigerian journal confirms this great revolutionist later passed away after a year's illness on April 20th, 1817. There was no battle, no arrow, no ambush in the hills, just a long, slow decline from illness and then death. And the evidence supporting this peaceful death is substantial. Consider this. Point 1. Dan Fodio had already retired from battle in 1811, 6 years before his death. He was not on any military campaign. He was not near the Benue Valley. He was in Sokoto, surrounded by students, teaching and writing. His movements are well documented because he was the spiritual leader of a vast empire. Point 2. The succession to Mohammed Bello was completely smooth. In Islamic Caliphate succession, the death of a caliph was a politically sensitive and extremely well-documented event. If Dan Fodio had been killed in battle, especially by a humiliating ambush, this would have been a seismic event with massive political consequences. There is no record of any such disruption. Point 3. In 1824, the British explorer Hugh Clapperton visited Sokoto and met Dan Fodio's son, Caliph Mohammed Bello. Clapperton was not a friendly observer. He was gathering intelligence for the British Empire. He never recorded any rumor, suggestion, or whisper that Dan Fodio had been killed in battle. If such a story had been circulating even at that time, Clapperton, who was actively seeking information about the Caliphate, would almost certainly have mentioned it. Point 4. The tomb of Dan Fodio is a simple structure, as is Islamic tradition for even the greatest of scholars. This is not the kind of burial you give a caliph who died in shame. It reflects normal Islamic practice, humble burial, focus on the afterlife. There is no evidence of a hasty or concealed burial. Every written source from the era, the Sokoto Chronicles, the works of scholars like Murray Last, whose definitive book, The Sokoto Caliphate, remains the gold standard for academic study of the period, all point to illness and peaceful death. Britannica's biography states simply, around 1815 he moved to Sokoto, and where he died, aged 62, in 1817. That is the official version, clear, consistent, well-sourced. But now, let us hear the other side. In the Benue Valley of central Nigeria, deep in the heartland of the Tiv and Idoma peoples, a very different account has been passed down for generations. Not in books, not in universities, but by word of mouth, from grandparent to grandchild, from elder to youth, through 2 centuries of oral tradition. And this is what those voices say. According to this oral tradition, preserved and documented by historians like Emmanuel Therese, who has studied and compiled these accounts, after the main Hausa states were conquered, the Sokoto Caliphate's forces turned their attention southward. The aim was to push the Jihad into the Middle Belt, through the Benue Valley, and ultimately, according to the oral account, all the way into Igbo land through what is now Enugu. But the terrain changed. The cavalry that had swept through the flat, open plains of Hausaland found itself struggling in the forested, hilly geography of central Nigeria, and the people they now faced were very different from the Hausa kingdoms they had overrun. The Tiv were and still are a fiercely independent people. They had no centralized king, no palace to besiege, no capital to capture. Their society was organized through clan networks and elder councils. They could not be defeated in a single decisive battle because there was no single decisive target. And according to the oral tradition, they had something else, unconventional warfare. The story describes a campaign of asymmetric resistance. Tiv warriors used poisoned arrows, a weapon the cavalry could not easily defend against. They poisoned water sources along the routes of advance, rendering the horses sick and immobile. They used swarms of bees, yes, bees, as weapons, driving them into the enemy ranks, and from the hilltops, they rolled stones down upon the advancing cavalry below. This was not a battle in the classical sense. It was a dismemberment, a slow, grinding defeat fought on home terrain by people who had everything to lose and nothing to surrender. And then, according to the Tiv oral account, something happened that changed everything. A poisoned arrow found its mark, the target, Uthman Dan Fodio himself. The oral tradition does not claim he died instantly on the battlefield. Instead, it says the poison entered him and began a slow, terrible deterioration of his health. He was carried away from the battle zone. His forces retreated, crippled by the terrain, the poisoned wells, the broken horses, and now the wounding of their spiritual commander. According to this account, Dan Fodio never recovered. The wound and its poison kept working through his body until he died back in Sokoto months or perhaps years later. A historian quoted in Blueprint newspapers, Emmanuel Therese, recorded the oral account this way. This version of events suggests that his death was not natural, but a consequence of battle wounds. The weakening of the cavalry through poisoned water and injured horses made further incursions into Tiv lands impossible, effectively halting the spread of the Jihad in that region. And then, perhaps most hauntingly of all, the oral tradition adds, had Dan Fodio recovered, the territorial expansion would have continued into Igbo land through Enugu. This is not just a story about one man's death. It is a story about a civilizational boundary. The oral tradition of the Tiv and their neighbors argues that it was their arrows, their warriors, their poisoned rivers that stopped the southward march of the Sokoto Caliphate. That without that resistance, without that victory in the Benue Hills, the entire religious and ethnic map of present-day southern Nigeria might look completely different. And they will tell you, The reason caliphate influence is non-existent in Tiv land today is precisely because their ancestors stopped it, in blood. This is a powerful story. This is a story of resistance, of African identity, of small peoples standing against massive empires. It is the kind of story that demands to be told. But is it true? Let's be honest with ourselves. Let's think carefully. Because this question, did Uthman Dan Fodio die peacefully, or was his death the result of a battle wound from the Benue Hills, is not just an academic puzzle. It carries real weight in present-day Nigeria, where the question of Fulani expansion into the Middle Belt is very much alive. So let us examine the key points of conflict. The cover-up question. Now, what about the cover-up claim? Is it plausible that the Sokoto Caliphate would hide how Dan Fodio died? Honestly, yes, in theory. Powerful empires have always managed the narratives around the deaths of their founders. The way a caliph or king dies matters enormously for legitimacy. A death in battle can be noble, but a death while being routed by a group of forest warriors with poisoned arrows is not the narrative you want for your founding father. However, and this is critical, for a cover-up to work at this scale, you would need to suppress the knowledge across hundreds of Sokoto chroniclers, across multiple Arab and Hausa language manuscripts, across the accounts given to British visitors like Hugh Clapperton just 7 years after the death, and across every Islamic scholar who wrote about the caliphate in the 19th century. That is an enormous cover-up, and such a cover-up leaves traces, inconsistencies, gaps, places where the story does not quite add up. Historians who have specifically studied these chronicles, scholars like Murray Last, whose life work is the Sokoto Caliphate, and Mervyn Hiskett, author of The Sword of Truth, have found no such gaps. Blueprint newspapers, which published the detailed Tiv oral account in 2025, acknowledged this tension directly. One side emphasizes documented history, while the other insists that oral traditions carry truths that may have been excluded from formal records. But of course, only a single version of the history can be true. Here is what I want you to sit with, because we have reached the most important part of this entire investigation. Whether Dan Fodio died from a poisoned arrow or from a long illness in his bed, neither story is as simple as it appears, and both stories point toward truths that official history often buries. Truth 1: the jihad was stopped. Whether or not Dan Fodio was personally wounded, the fact remains that his caliphate's military expansion was halted at the Middle Belt. The Tiv, the Idoma, the Birom, the Gweri, the Chamber, the Igala, these peoples resisted. They were never conquered, and today's Nigeria still lives with the consequences of that uncrossed line. Truth 2: official African history, especially caliphate history, was written almost entirely by the victors and their administrators. The Arabic language chronicles of the Sokoto Caliphate are extraordinary documents, but they are the caliphate's own records. They are not neutral. They would naturally minimize defeats, downplay costly campaigns in the south, and present the death of their founding caliph in the most dignified terms possible. This does not mean they lied, but it means we should always ask, what is not in the official record? What happened in places where no Sokoto scribe was present to write it down? Truth 3: the oral tradition of the Middle Belt peoples is not folklore. It is history, just history that was never given paper. Generations of Tiv and Idoma communities have maintained a consistent, detailed narrative about the Fulani Jihad, the battle at the Benue Hills, and its aftermath. The specific claim about Dan Fodio being wounded may not be verifiable, but the broader claim that the jihad was stopped by fierce local resistance is fully supported even by academic sources. Moses Ochenu of Vanderbilt University, one of the foremost scholars of Middle Belt history, has written extensively about how caliphate-aligned historical narratives became the dominant framework under both the Emirate system and British colonial rule. He argues that the Middle Belt peoples were effectively written out of Nigerian history, their resistance minimized, their identity subsumed under a northern label they never accepted. Truth 4: Dan Fodio himself was more complex than either story allows. He was a man who began as a scholar of peace and ended as the founding caliph of a military empire. He retired disillusioned, watching his own revolution devour the values it claimed to uphold. The Islamic scholars who study his writings say his later years were marked by deep spiritual wrestling, a man asking whether the violence had been worth it, whether the caliphate was truly what Allah intended. This is not the portrait of a comfortable man enjoying retirement in his 60s. This is the portrait of a deeply tormented intellectual reckoning with the consequences of power. When he died, however, he died a complicated man, a great man, a man whose legacy today is inseparable from the contested identity of Nigeria itself. So, after all of this, what do we actually know? We know Uthman Dan Fodio died on April 20th, 1817, in Sokoto at the age of 62. We know every written contemporary source, Arab, Hausa, British, records his death as illness. No single documented source from his era records his death as battlefield-related. We know he had retired from direct military involvement at least 6 years before his death. We know the jihad was halted at the Middle Belt. The Tiv, Idoma, and their neighbors were never conquered. We know the Tiv and Idoma oral tradition is consistent, detailed, and has been preserved across generations. It attributes this halting of the jihad to a decisive military resistance in which Dan Fodio was personally affected. We know no neutral contemporary source corroborates the battle wound story. So what is the verdict? The most historically defensible conclusion is this: Uthman Dan Fodio died from illness in Sokoto, as the official record states. The specific claim of a poisoned arrow wound from the Benue battle cannot be verified, and several historical facts about his timeline and location make it logistically challenging. But, and this is the but that matters, the Tiv oral tradition is preserving a real history. The jihad was stopped at the Middle Belt. The resistance was fierce and effective. The Benue Valley peoples did fight back, and they have every right to tell their story of that resistance with pride. The question of whether a poisoned arrow physically struck Uthman Dan Fodio is not the point. The point is that somewhere in the forested hills of central Nigeria, the most powerful Islamic empire in African history, with its unstoppable cavalry and its divine mandate, was stopped, not by weakness, but by the courage of people who refused to be conquered. That truth does not need a cover-up to be real. It is real regardless of what killed Uthman Dan Fodio. Uthman Dan Fodio died over 200 years ago, but the questions his life raised about power, about justice, about the relationship between religion and empire, about who gets to write history and who gets written out of it, those questions are very much alive today. 200 years later, in the same Benue Valley where his cavalry was stopped, people are still dying in conflicts whose roots trace back to this unresolved 19th century story. History is never just the past, it is always the present wearing old clothes. Now, if this investigation has sparked something in you, if you want to go even deeper into the world of Uthman Dan Fodio, we have already done the groundwork for you. On this channel, we published a full documentary titled How Uthman Dan Fodio's Jihad Changed West Africa Forever. And in that video, we went deep into his origins, his formation as a scholar, and the full story of the jihad itself. We asked a question that historians have argued about for decades. Was the jihad religiously motivated, or was it political? And by the end of that video, the answer becomes very clear. If you haven't seen it yet, the link is on your screen right now. Go watch it immediately after this, because the two videos together tell the complete story. If you found this investigation valuable, if you believe that Africa's real history deserves to be told fully, not filtered through the versions that powerful people prefer, then support this channel. Subscribe, share this video with someone who loves African history. Leave a comment below telling me which version of this story you believe or what questions you still have. I am your host, and this is Edu History TV, where Africa's forgotten truths come back to life. Until next time, the ancestors are watching.
Shout for the bell!